someone at the FBI recognized the importance of that name immediately and marked up the original copy. That's probably true. I would hope so. I would hope the FBI would know who the guy was. The FBI hid that information in two ways. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think it would be futile for me to try to understand and explain everything they're talking about in this thread on the Education Forum. So I'm going to focus in on this one thing about the identity of the unknown caller. There seems to be a consensus in the forum discussion that this unknown caller has been identified by them being the persons in the discussion, as Elizabeth Bentley. And here you can see one of the members of this discussion is matter-of-factly referring to the call as the Bentley call, as if they have established this to be a fact, and they build on from there. And this is a very common practice among Harvey and Lee folks, where they establish a fact which I'm not so sure of, and then they build upon that established fact. And so they might be building on a foundation that is not reliable. But anyway, they've made me interested in whether or not Elizabeth Bentley was this caller. In the 1950s, Elizabeth Bentley became very well known as the Spy Queen, and she appeared in newspapers. Her photograph appeared in newspapers, and stories about her appeared. She was a big witness in trials against people accused of being communist spies, and she became very well known in the newspapers. She even wrote a book called Out of Bondage, describing her experiences. I have not read the book, but as I understand it, she describes her experiences as a communist operative, a spy for the Soviet Union. And so it's not, she doesn't seem to have been very shy about it. She was very public about her being a communist spy and exposing other communist spies. So to me it seems odd that if this is Elizabeth Bentley calling the Tippits in Connecticut, that she would request that nothing be said to the press, since Elizabeth Bentley had been very prominent in the press prior to this, and it was well known from the press reports, it was well known publicly that she had betrayed the communists. So what has she got to lose at this point? It's possible it could be Bentley, but it seems to me that she would have already have been acclimated to the waters of being publicly known as a traitor to the communists. So I don't see why she would ask Mrs. Tippit or the Tippits there not to talk to the press about her calling. And the anonymous caller also said this: she was from New York and had come here to make the call so that she could not be traced. Well, what this obviously means is that the anonymous caller said she was from New York and came to Connecticut so that the call could not be traced. That is, that she lives in New York, but she just came to Connecticut to make this phone call. And while it is true that Elizabeth Bentley had lived in New York, we know from this 1951 FBI document that she had purchased a house in Connecticut in 1951 after getting money from selling her book, and through the years until her death in 1963, I see no indication that she ever relinquished this house, that she ever sold this house, that she continued, and the indication is that she continued to use it as her residence, her main residence. So it seems to me if this anonymous caller had been Elizabeth Bentley, that she would have no reason to come here to make the call to prevent its being traced, because she already lived here in Connecticut. And note here that Mrs. Tippit thought the woman The anonymous caller had an Austrian or German accent, while Mr. Tippit believed it was Spanish. But Bentley was an American who was born in Connecticut, so it seems very unlikely to me that she had any kind of a foreign accent. And why would Bentley even call the Tippits in Connecticut, even if she thought they were related to J.D. Tippit, who had been shot in Dallas? We know from FBI documents that she had a continuing relationship with the FBI from the 1940s, when she ratted out the communists, until the very day she died. So why would she call the Tippits and also ask them not to talk to the press? What is the purpose here of this caller if it's Bentley? When if she wants to give information to the authorities, we know she can pick up the phone and call the FBI. Of course, anyone can do that, but we know that she knows who to call and who to talk to. So why would she call a cartoonist in Connecticut to tell this information about Oswald if she could have called the FBI? So I think my original impression is probably correct, that the anonymous caller probably was a hoaxer or a kook. That is, someone who had read the newspapers in New York or in the New York area, or you would say Connecticut is in the New York area. Someone who had read these things and knew a few names associated with the communists, or remembered them partially, thought it was Cardos instead of Gardos, perhaps, and wanted to play a joke, probably. We have numerous documents of that sort, where people were drunk or mischievous, and they made telephone calls to other people, or gave information even to the FBI that was incorrect, just because they wanted to perpetrate a hoax, or make themselves seem important, or whatever their motivations were. We know people did this sort of thing, and here we have something that looks exactly like this sort of thing. So I think that's probably what it is. However, while I'm convinced that the caller was not Elizabeth Bentley, I'm not convinced that it was a hoax or a kook call. And I'll have to get into why I think that, I guess. First, we'll deal with Oswald's biological father. He died before Oswald was born. So the caller could not have seen Oswald with his biological father. But Oswald's mother, Marguerite, did remarry in 1945, when Oswald was 5 years old going on 6. She married Edwin Ekdahl. And the official story has Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother and Edwin Ekdahl spending 6 months in Boston, living with Ekdahl's son. However, as the first quote there on top comes from an FBI report, Ekdahl's son, Dewey Ekdahl, stated that he never knew the name of his father's second wife or anything about her. So I think it's pretty obvious that Dewey Ekdahl, Edwin Ekdahl's son, never lived with Marguerite and Lee. He would have been about 14 at the time that they supposedly lived with him for 6 months. And in the middle there, this is from Robert Oswald's Warren Commission testimony. Robert Oswald is Lee Harvey Oswald's brother. He said, "I understand Mr. Ekdahl had been married and had a son by a prior marriage, and they had lived together, all of them, Lee, my mother, Mr. Ekdahl, and his son, in Boston." So Robert Oswald has the story that Lee and his mother lived with Ekdahl's son for 6 months in Boston, he says. Boston is pretty close to New York, especially when you're coming from Fort Worth, Texas. So they could have gone to New York, and Robert would never have known because he didn't go with them. So it could be that in 1945, Edwin Ekdahl was in New York City with Lee Harvey Oswald and some other boy that is supposedly Ekdahl's son. So the anonymous call might be referring to something real, even though it's not. It wouldn't be Cardos or Gardos. It might be Edwin Ekdahl and some other person that she actually saw Lee Harvey Oswald with. And it may even be that she saw Harvey, and that Harvey isn't really a Hungarian refugee, but he's just some New York kid. Of course, you would have to speculate to come to that conclusion. And Marguerite Oswald, who was questioned extensively by the Warren Commission, was not asked anything about Boston. And I think it's kind of funny that they asked the sons, Robert and John Pick, about Boston, but they didn't ask the only living person who had been there, or that we know had been there. That's Marguerite Oswald, and they had her right in front of them, and they never asked her about this Boston thing. So, even though I think it's unlikely, I think it's possible that this Connecticut phone call to the cartoonist Tippit might actually have been a genuine sort of source of information. That the caller was not Elizabeth Bentley, but could have been somebody who did see Oswald, whether it was Harvey or Lee, probably with Edwin Ekdahl, and maybe Edwin Ekdahl's brother-in-law. But I don't want to get into Edwin Ekdahl's brother-in-law here, because that's going too far for this video. Now, going back to Elizabeth Bentley, even though I don't think she's the anonymous caller, I think this is pretty interesting. This was an FBI report on the day she died. For information of Bureau and New York, Elizabeth Bentley died at New Haven Hospital on this date after an operation performed on previous day to remove an abdominal tumor. The funeral is scheduled for Thursday afternoon next from Robert's Funeral Home in Middleton, Connecticut. Of interest to Bureau, during the last 2 weeks of terminal illness, Bentley, who had no close family relations, kept New Haven office fully informed of her illness and demonstrated marked regard and affection toward Bureau to the end. I think that's interesting. I don't think I'm going to comment on it, but it shows, well, I guess I will comment on it. It shows that Bentley, if it's true, it shows that Bentley was favorable towards the FBI till the day she died, and it shows that the FBI was interested enough in her to keep track of her until the day she died. And the day she died is about 2 weeks after the assassination, and just a few days after the anonymous phone call. But apparently she was terminally ill at the time that phone call was made, and it's interesting to me that the FBI is interested in her at this time. Of course, this is just after the assassination, and it might imply that the FBI or certain people in the FBI were concerned that she might know something about Oswald. And I think there's reason to think that Edwin Ekdahl might have been involved with communists, but that's not the topic of this video, so I think I'll just end it here. Well, one more thing. The hospital that Bentley died at was the Yale New Haven Hospital, what is now called the Yale New Haven Hospital. It had begun its relationship with Yale in 1913, and George W. Bush happened to be born at this hospital. So there is, coincidentally, a George Herbert Walker Bush connection to the hospital in which Elizabeth Bentley died.